During this crawl project, we're going to create an original Scratchboard from a photograph that you take. This is a fantastic medium to work with. It's a lot of fun, so let's get started. During this project, you'll create an original Scratchboard image using a crawl level design make process. We'll combine technology concepts with classical media, apply proper use of Scratchboard materials, and develop fine motor skills. I'll cover the prep and print using either Photoshop or Photopea. You can use any image that you choose. We'll adjust that with the threshold, and then I'll show you the materials that you need. I'll also quickly demo the transferring of the image. And finally, we'll discuss creating texture and value with Scratch tools. When you've finished, you'll have an accurate, complete Sgraffito image. A couple of tips. The subject matter is up to you, and not every image is going to work. Try to shoot for a 50-50 black and white threshold once you put the threshold in the application. Try to fill up your picture plane. We don't want small images on a large sheet of Scratchboard. And make sure you press hard when you're transferring. We need to be able to see those lines that you transfer with the pen. And last but not least, make sure you scratch the surface very lightly. If you scratch too hard, you can scratch into the under substrate, the white stuff, and it will peel up some of the film that's a protective coating over top of it. We're going to adjust our image in an application called Photopea. It's like Photoshop, and the steps that I'm going to go over are the exact same in Photoshop if you choose to use it. Basically what we're going to do is take an image, put a threshold on it, which basically takes light areas, makes them white, darker areas, makes them black, and we're going to adjust the image so that we can transfer that to the Scratchboard. To do that, you go to Open, select the photograph that you're choosing to do a Scratchboard of, click Open, and the image should just pop up. Now, not every image that you bring into an application is going to work. You may throw a threshold on an image and start working with the histogram to lighten or darken areas, and it may just not look very good. So if it takes 2 or 3 or 4 times to get a good threshold image, just know that that's pretty normal. I'm going to go ahead and crop my image down a little bit. I'll use the marquee tool, select the area that I want to work with, go down to crop, and I'm going to click auto tone as well, try to get the lighting a little bit better. And then under image adjustments is where threshold is. So we go to image adjustments and threshold. When I click threshold, you'll see that the image is turned to black and white. Up here in the upper right hand corner is a histogram. We can go ahead and meter this. We can adjust the threshold, and by default Photopea has put it at 128. So as I move this slider back and forth, it will either lighten or darken areas. You might find that when you adjust your image by making it lighter or darker, there are certain areas that look better. We can add a layer over top of your image here in a minute. I'll walk you through how to do that so that we can combine parts of an image. So with my threshold at 128, looks pretty good. I can go ahead and use that, and then I can export it as a JPEG to print it. Click Save, and it will download, and I can open that up in Preview or whatever driver you're using to print it. Now let's say that there's a particular area that I wanted to include in my image. So when I was adjusting the histogram, I noticed that the shoulder disappeared when I had the face looking how I wanted it. But I want to include the shoulder as well to kind of fill up the picture plane a little bit. To do that, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take my background layer, I'm going to drag that directly down into this layers tab and create a new layer. Now I have 2 layers to work with. I'll adjust those independently, and all I'm going to do is erase through layer 1 to relieve the background in layer 2. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and click on this top layer, and I'm going to name it face. And I'll click on my background, and I can rename that if I want, or I can just leave it background depending on how many layers you want to readjust. So I'm going to go back to my adjustments, click adjustment, go down and hit threshold. And making sure that you're on the face layer, I'll put a threshold on that. That's 128. Now I'm going to turn this little eyeball off on that face layer and make sure that I have my background selected. Notice when I click the background layer, it became darker. So with it selected, I'm going to go back and put a different level of threshold on this. So I'll go back to my adjustments, click threshold, and make the adjustment so that I can see that right shoulder. That looks pretty good there. I'll leave it at 80, hit OK, and now I have 2 levels of threshold. Now the last step is to go back to that top layer, turn my eyeball on so that I can see the top layer, and all I'm going to do is erase the area that I want to keep background. I can turn the opacity down on this layer so that I can see that background layer, or I can just go over here and select my eraser tool, which is here, and go ahead and erase the area that I want to keep. And I'll turn the size of it up just a little bit to make it go faster. Making sure I'm on that top layer, I'll start erasing some of it to relieve the layer underneath it. In my Scratchboard, I'm going to go ahead and adjust where the chin is, and I'm going to lighten that area. So again, I'm just using this image as a guide. It's not going to be done verbatim. I'll make some adjustments to the actual Scratchboard. But just so that I have something that's pretty accurate to transfer, I'll go ahead and clean this up just a little bit. Once you're happy with your composite, the different layers put together, you can just go back up and print it the exact same way as I just showed you. Save it as a JPEG and print it for transfer. So we have all the materials here that we'll need. We have the printed image that we just prepped in Photopea. We have a Scratchboard that's roughly the same size. We have a ballpoint pen. I like to use red pens. You can just see the ink a little bit better so you don't have to go back over areas that you've already traced. A little bit of tape. And definitely get some scrap sheets of Scratchboard. It's a good practice to test technique and work with texture on those scrap sheets rather than committing them directly to the Scratchboard. If you go in and scratch away areas, there's no way to put it back. The black just doesn't match if you add anti-ink or paint. And I always like to have a reference image, in this case a black and white version, a small version of the original photo. That way I can make adjustments to my Scratchboard if I want to omit or add anything that I like in the image. I also suggest using something to put all of your work in. Scratchboards by nature can obviously scratch pretty easily, so if you don't take care of them, you can have a really nice image and accidentally scratch it and ruin it. So I just use these envelopes and I stuff everything in there for storage in between sessions. Now to get started, the first thing you're going to do is tape your image to the Scratchboard. Take a little piece of tape, tape it at the top. This will allow you to register the image as you check to see if your line pressure is working for you. Take your pen and start tracing general areas. I would suggest starting with big areas of white or black, and I get the question all the time, do I trace the white or do I trace the black? And the answer is yes. It's the exact same thing. So if I just focus on the white and trace around these big areas first, and check to see if you have a dent on your Scratchboard, and it's hard to see in this video, but there is a very faint dent that's being created by the ballpoint pen being pushed into the Scratchboard. I'm going to trace around big general areas first, checking every once in a while, and then I can go into these detail areas. Now, you don't have to trace every little ounce of texture. You can if you'd like to, but that can interfere with the actual creation of the texture. So I would just trace around big areas of white and black, and then go back and try to mimic those texture areas after you work with a scrap sheet a little bit. So I'm tracing absolutely everything that I feel I need. I lift off my image to check to see if I have my lines, and in the video you can't see it, but if you hold the Scratchboard at an angle up to the light, you'll be able to see it pretty well, and you're working pretty close. So as long as you press heavy with that pen, you'll be able to see the dent. Now, as far as where to start scratching, again, I would take a scrap sheet and start working with the scratch knife. I'm using a number 2 blade in this case, so I can get a faint line, or I can get a pretty heavy line depending on the angle at which I hold the knife. You can use tattoo needles, sandpaper. There's a whole array of different tools that you can buy specifically for Scratchboard, but for this starter image, this crawl image, I would start with a number 2 blade. They go pretty fast and teach you some control. I'm just going to outline this little neck area and start to work it. I can scratch away as much or as little as I need. And remember the tip of staying very, very light with your scratches. When you get to those areas that have some detail, again, I'd go back to a scrap sheet and start working that scrap sheet just to try to mimic the textures that you're trying to create. In this case, I'm holding the knife sideways and I'm creating very, very faint lines. You can cross hatch, go in and work stippling, little tiny dots, or you can just freehand and try to match any texture that you feel you need to match. Planing off big areas, holding the side of the knife and lightly scratching is probably the best way to go with a number 2. And there's nothing wrong with going in and freehanding some doodles just to gain some confidence with a scratch knife and the scratch material. As you work through the project, remember to stay focused on those areas that you're confident working first, maybe big areas of white. Remember to scratch again very, very lightly. We don't want to cut through the film or cut into the white. And when you're finished, you'll have an image that represents the threshold that you created and printed, and it should be pretty accurate. I hope you enjoyed this project, and I hope it encourages you and gives you some confidence to try the walk and then finally the run projects for Scratchboard and other videos. Make sure you hit like and subscribe, and see you next time.